Can the Conservatives move on from Partygate? How green is Keir Starmer's green energy plan? And should the state step in to help with rising mortgage bills? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Matt Warman, Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds, political reporter for The Sun Noah Hoffman, and the host of Politico's Westminster Insider podcast, Alva Ray. Today, MPs debate the report into Boris Johnson and Partygate.
This is a matter for the House, not for the government, and that's why each and individual colleagues will make up their own mind when the time comes.
We'll assess how damaging this has been for the Conservatives. Also today,
a credible plan to manage the change, to protect good jobs, create good jobs, no cliff edges.
Keir Starmer says he's going to throw everything at going green, but he also says we're going to need oil and gas for decades. Which is it? And as mortgage costs continue to rise, should the government step in?
The worst thing to do would be to spend money in order to provide a short-term relief.
Let's start with that story you just heard there in the headlines. Here's BBC News covering it. Mortgage rates. Average two-year fix now above 6%. And, of course, we are expecting a decision from the Bank of England on Thursday in terms of whether or not they put up interest rates again, which is widely expected. But there's now pressure to hold on because mortgage lenders have been pulling, repricing deals at a rapid rate in recent weeks, and people are struggling to pay. But is it the government's responsibility to help people with their mortgage payments, Matt?
Well, I think it's the government's responsibility to provide an economic picture that means people can pay their mortgages. That's not the same thing as saying that there should be some sort of cash payment to help people as mortgage costs have gone up. What the most important thing has to be is to get inflation under control, because that's what will be putting more money into people's pockets, on top of what is a huge package to help people with the cost of living, whether it's around energy prices or a whole host of other issues.
Right, but it's not their responsibility, the government's, to actually pay or have a scheme to help people, even if they're having to find hundreds of pounds.
I think for the government to subsidise mortgage costs would simply be saving up a cost that would come back to bite us later.
Do you agree? Is it the government's role?
So, to state the uncomfortable truth, when the Bank of England puts up interest rates like this, it is designed to take money out of the economy. So it's very, very painful, but it is designed to do that. What we should be interested in and focused on as politicians is why are people and why is this country so exposed to inflation? That's everything from our energy policy, which has left us particularly exposed, but crucially in this case, it's the price of housing. And the reason this is so much more painful than the 1970s or 1980s is that people have so much more money they've borrowed, and that comes down to not enough homes being built. And that's why I think the government's complete retreat from building homes.
Yeah. No, I understand your wider
That's
point.
the problem. But this is what it means. We don't get enough of this, I think, sometimes.
So should the government step? Would a Labour government step in
to pay people's mortgages?
Yes.
No, you can't do that, because it would be, you'd have the Bank of England and the government completely fighting against each other, trying to do the same thing. So that's not the way. But we've got to care about what this means for people, because it's incredibly difficult. Now, when people,
what does that mean?
It means the fact that people have to borrow so much money for a home which, in real terms, would have cost them a fraction of the multiple of their earnings in the 1970s or 1980s. The fact you're paying so much more today in cash terms above what you earn, that hasn't kept kilter with inflation, is the real source of pain. But it comes down to not enough homes, real restrictions that have prevented that from happening, and frankly a government which is going in the wrong direction on that.
What do you think, Noah? Is it the government's responsibility?
No, as much as many people would love the government to step in. Matt and Jonathan were correct. There isn't this endless supply, and also it would put government at odds with the Bank of England. But I just wanted to reiterate what Jonathan said about this huge issue the Tories have with housing, which I think, Matt, is going to come back to bite you at an election. What does anyone who is sort of young, even middle class, we've done everything right, we've gone to university or, done an apprenticeship, we're working in good jobs, we're working hard, we can't afford houses. It's not fair, it's not what we were promised. And now then there's this issue with extortionate interest rates, which the Bank of England argue are necessary, to tackle inflation. What are you going to say to people when they ask you about that on the doorstep come a general election?
And the huge challenge has to be to get those house building numbers up further. Part of this is also about controlling immigration. I think we shouldn't leave that out. But it is about the supply versus demand. And we've seen a huge shift. We have seen some success from the Conservative government in building houses, but it's no secret that we need to do a huge amount more.
Right.
There is a slightly unfortunate photograph of Michael Gove, the Secretary of State responsible for housing, out campaigning for the by-elections this weekend, holding a leaflet with a little tick beside a statement saying, "We've slashed house building targets in this area." So unfortunately, that's the national picture. Noah's absolutely right. Housing is a huge issue, affecting so many people in different ways, whether it's worries about mortgage or about rent costs. But then actually in certain constituencies that the Tories are trying to hold on to, they're actually presenting a completely different message. I don't know which it is.
And of course, mandatory house targets have also been scrapped by the government, by Rishi Sunak. But do you think the government should step in? Is there a moral imperative in the way the government obviously saw with energy bills and paying people's wages during the pandemic? Is this different when it comes to the struggles that many families and households are going to face to try and find the money for the rising bills?
I mean, I think there's been a bit of a change in politics since the pandemic, where it became much more normalised for governments to step in and provide that kind of support. And since the pandemic, where we saw so many government interventions, I think Liz Truss felt there was this overwhelming pressure before she became Prime Minister to do something big on energy bills. We don't talk about that much, but she really quickly made a pledge to help people with their energy costs, which was more than the furlough scheme. And we didn't have a big moment where we all sat around panels and talked about that in the same way, because the pressure was different. And I think that there'll be people watching this who hear the reasons, it's as stated by Matt and Jonathan, but who just feel so worried about this. It's a very intimate way in which people are affected by what happened a few months ago, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. And I think they'll just think, well, what do I actually do? It's lovely that we're going to try to get inflation down, but that's so abstract. What do I do when my mortgage costs go from £1,000 to £6,000 a month or something crazy?
But I do think it's also important to say that what is the thing that troubled the markets most about the mini budget? It was that enormous taxpayer commitment. And I think that help with energy bills was obviously the right thing to do. It was obviously essential, but you do have to try and square that circle.
Is that what it was?
Well, no. I mean, the thing about the mini budget, Matt, was actually that huge spending item, as I said, that was expected. The markets took that. What they couldn't accept was the complete irresponsibility of slashing the top rate of tax, a whole range of other.
Come on, Jonathan, you know that made no difference whatsoever to the markets. It was the multi-billion pound
No, I strongly disagree,
that was around the energy price.
How much was it worth? How much was it worth in the end, Jonathan?
The whole of the...
No, the idea of slashing the top rate of tax in cash terms, it was several billion.
It was several billion, but I mean, let's be honest, we've never seen in any budget ever before a real terms increase in the cost of borrowing for the government, whilst the Chancellor's on his feet giving that statement. I mean, I was looking at my phone, the markets went crackers, the pound went down, and it just continued, and then obviously Kwasi made it worse by doubling down on it, but that was at the heart of it.
That is the circle that government has to square. It's how do you balance the cost of helping people when we know helping people in the instance of mortgage interest would be the right thing to do?
Well, another way of helping...
and in this case, it's inflation.
Well, another way of helping people, of course, in terms of tackling cost of living pressures would be to cut taxes, which is what the Conservatives keep saying they're going to do, and they're a low-tax party, despite the fact that we have the highest tax burden in 70 years. The Sunday Telegraph, Jeremy Hunt, Chancellor instructs Whitehall bosses to find spending and job cuts at the moment. Are they affordable? Will they ever be affordable between now and the next election, a cut in tax?
Well, the Chancellor's been very clear that that's what he wants to do. Obviously, there will be a budget coming up before the end of this year.
Would you like to see it?
Well, what I want to see is an affordable package, and what that has to mean is both putting more money into people's pockets, of course it does, but it also means making sure we've got the resources to fund the public services that people need. So that balance is something that I think will probably see a decision made much closer to the time than it is now. Because, for instance, we're also seeing government borrowing costs rise as interest rates rise. So there are lots of factors to take into account. The idea that we're going to sit here now and say, right, this is the plan rather than this is the aspiration is obviously daft.
Let's have a look at this headline in the Financial Times, because this afternoon MPs will be gathering in the House of Commons to discuss the damning report into Boris Johnson, who urges allies not to oppose damning report into his conduct. This is a headline from the weekend. It follows the release of the Privileges report, which concluded that Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, deliberately misled Parliament over lockdown parties. The report was published last Thursday, recommended that Boris Johnson be suspended from the Commons for 90 days if he'd remained an MP. He, of course, had already quit as an MP some days beforehand. It also recommends that Boris Johnson be denied a parliamentary pass, which he would normally be entitled to as an ex-MP, and that was because of his interventions and labelling the Privileges Committee a kangaroo court. How are you going to vote this afternoon, Matt?
Well, I'd say two things if I can, and I'm conscious that what I'm going to say is that there is some tension between the two. The first is that, for me, Parliament needs to go back to the convention of saying we have delegated to the Privileges Committee the right to judge members of Parliament in this way. Parliament needs to accept that the Privileges Committee has that authority. I think
you reject the complaints and the labelling of the committee by colleagues of yours.
We as parliamentarians have set up a system that sets that up. If you're going to challenge the system, fair enough. I don't challenge that system. I think the system has to persist. Now, therefore, and I think the fact that we voted against the Owen Paterson report, I think from a personal level, something I deeply regret, the way the government behaved. I think it was an aberration, and we now are where we are. But I think if you're going to say that we're not going to delegate that responsibility, we're going to imagine that every member of Parliament is somehow on the committee themselves, it is right that we look at the evidence, we say, what would I have argued for if I was on that committee myself? And so I sit there looking at the report, yes, and I think, well, actually, would I have argued for a 90-day suspension? Would I have wanted to understand why that was the conclusion that they came to? And as Michael Gove said on Sunday to Laura Kuenssberg, I think there are lots of things that I know I would have wanted to ask if I was on that committee.
But the bottom line is, what are you going to do this afternoon? Are you going to back the report and the sanctions?
So I come to the conclusion that there should be no vote this afternoon. Parliament should say, this is the responsibility of the Privileges Committee. We allow them to get on with it. But ultimately, just as I did with the Margaret Ferrier report subsequent to Owen Paterson, then I think abstaining is the right logical course if you don't agree with every single word, but you do accept the Privileges Committee.
So do you broadly think the 90 days was too tough?
Well, so I think that if I was on the committee, I would have asked the question of the chair, for instance, why is it you think that we're going to extend this repeatedly? But I come back to Parliament should be backing the principle of the Privileges Committee, which is more important than any one case.
I know you're going to obviously be backing the report, but just before I get a fuller answer from you, no, it's interesting that Boris Johnson called off his allies not to oppose the report into his conduct. Is that because there just weren't enough people who were going to stand up for it? It would have been embarrassing today if it had gone to a vote.
Yes. In short, he doesn't have the numbers that he used to have, and we saw this happen with the Windsor framework when, after Rishi Sunak announced it, he was umming and ahhing about what to say. He then came out, he had Liz Truss behind him as well, Priti Patel, and said, I don't support this, and it managed to still fly through Parliament with very limited opposition. The same thing would happen with the Privileges Committee report, and so in order to avoid that, he's saying, no, don't make a fuss. Let's all move on.
Does it matter if the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is there or not? Or just take the line that Matt Warman has said, the Privileges Committee report will be nodded through?
Of course it matters if he's there. And I've got to be honest, I am so sick of the Conservative Party over this and all of these reports and these shenanigans. I don't mean this personally, Matt. I would fire you all into the sea the way you behave over this. Look, the report itself speaks for itself. People shouldn't listen to a Labour MP like me give the case. It's 8 or 9 pages, executive summary at the front. Read that, and it is forensic, and it is absolutely damning. And if the Prime Minister is so afraid of his own MPs, I mean, who is he afraid of? Bill Cash and the Boris gang? I mean, this is ridiculous. Of course he should stand up for high standards. Of course he should be there. Having read that report, for people to try and find elements of it to maybe discredit the committee or the personnel on it, honestly, it's a disgrace.
Right, so you do want to move on?
I think the report speaks for itself. I think pass it, there'll be a vote today.
All right.
Accept the conclusions. I see no other case other than that.
All right. Well, let's talk to Luke Trill and assess the damage, if any, to the Conservative Party and its brand. Luke is the director of More in Common, who are public opinion researchers. Welcome to you. How damaging has this Partygate row been for the Conservatives, Luke?
hugely damaging to the party, much more than your typical Westminster scandal. And the reason for that is that during the pandemic, everyone has a story. They have a story of something that they missed, a wedding, a funeral, their children being able to sit exams. Everyone has a story of sacrifice. And when you contrast that with what's emerged over the course of the past couple of years, what was happening at the heart of government, fast forward right to the images that we saw this weekend from CCHQ, it really sticks in people's throat as one of the most egregious examples of one rule for them, another for us. So that's one reason it's so damaging. But the other reason is it's so damaging is the continuation of this story just makes people think that the Conservative Party are addicted to chaos. You know, they're much more interested in the discussion you were having just before about mortgages and just don't understand why this government can't move on and focus on the real issues which are affecting people, and instead is trapped in this loop of dealing with sort of internal psychodrama.
Do you think they can move on from, to use that hackneyed phrase, do you think they can move on, improve their standing ahead of the general election?
Well, there's no doubt some of the damage that has been done, you can't move on from. And when we chat to people in focus groups, they say, I'm sorry, for me, this was the final straw. But I think for others, there is an opportunity to move on. And I dare say that I think the Prime Minister is in danger of missing that moment today if he doesn't come and vote on the report. Because what we increasingly hear is Boris Johnson is gone off the stage, and yet he keeps making so much noise, and Rishi doesn't stand up to him. And it's starting to make the public feel like the Prime Minister isn't quite as strong as he needs to be in leading the country. So I think one big step to moving on would be the Prime Minister doing that. And then I think the second thing has then got to be moving beyond this drama and a relentless focus on improving people's everyday, giving an answer on the cost of living, the NHS, interest rates. That's really the Conservatives' only hope at this point.
Luke, stay with us. Addicted to chaos, even if Boris Johnson exits stage left or right, for that matter, the chaos is still there.
Well, I think what the government has to do is demonstrate that it is not talking about all of this stuff. It is getting on with addressing that cost of living crisis. And the trouble is the only way you can demonstrate that is by doing it, right? We have to provide people with the real evidence. And all of this talk around other issues but does infuriate people. Luke's absolutely right. But it also distracts from the opportunity to talk about the stuff that the government is doing, that hugely important programme in the run-up to the general election.
The Conservative Party doesn't really appreciate what an electoral asset Rishi Sunak is on this. He actually polls better than the party at large. The party has been really damaged by Boris Johnson, but people do sort of think that Rishi Sunak is different to that. And that's one of, I'd say that's your sort of last hope in a way. And so it's genuinely perplexing to me that they aren't making more of this moment. I mean, being ruthlessly pragmatic, putting clearer blue water between Rishi Sunak and what's gone before. Instead, we've heard all this caution from Matt, from the Prime Minister himself. I don't think it makes sense in terms of the message that they're trying to land, that the Conservative Party isn't like this anymore.
Well, if I can just put one counterpoint, the reality is that my inbox is full of people saying, please vote for the report, against it, and abstain on it. So the idea that it is a sort of somehow a clear-cut issue where you can't take into account the range of entirely legitimate views, all of whom want us to tackle the cost of living crisis, I think is not going to fly.
Except that the reality is that Labour overtook you at the point of Partygate, and you've never recovered. That was the moment that damaged you. There's more, you know, more things have happened since, but that was the moment. And how does the Tory party sort of say goodbye to that? Well, I think this is the moment, but they're not seizing it.
Well, what makes it more difficult is what Luke referred to, which is this video. Let's show you part of it. It emerged at the weekend. It shows a party, clearly, at the Conservative Party headquarters. You can see staffers drinking and dancing. It was during the COVID pandemic. It was published by the Mirror in dates from December 2020 when London was in Tier 2 restrictions, and it's reported that the police are looking into this. What did you think when you saw that, Matt?
It's horrific. It's inexcusable. And I think the fact that this was going on after the mayoral campaign wrapped up, it is absolutely appalling. We shouldn't for a second try and defend it. But what we should, I do think, say is that this is something that the government has apologised for. It will continue to apologise for. These are the actions of staffers rather than members of Parliament. But that's not the point. We have to say that this is an issue that is something that should never have happened.
No, two of the people involved in that gathering have been awarded honours in Boris Johnson Johnson's resignation honours list, which came out a little while ago. The same day, in fact, he quit as an MP. And those two people, one of them got a peerage. Sean Bailey, a former Conservative candidate for London Mayor, and Ben Mallet, a Conservative Party aide, was awarded an OBE. Should they give those honours back?
I think the public will be looking at that, and many of them will think, absolutely, you know, why was I watching a live stream of a funeral on Facebook when this was happening? But I think the whole honours system in general and the way that Boris Johnson has made use of it has really put into question the entire functioning of the House of Lords and the honours system. I think a lot of people are very upset that perhaps some people who have quite limited experience in politics are suddenly going to be life peers. I mean, where's mine? So
it's in the post, no doubt. I mean, would Labour strip them of their either a peerage and or award in this case?
Well, they should definitely be blocked. None of these resignation honours should go ahead. I don't know whether you can legally withdraw honours from people.
I think you can.
I've generally no idea.
You could write, I think, to the relevant body, Jonathan, and ask for a forfeiture if you fancied it. Will you do that? Will Labour do that?
I mean, I think clearly what we can see as being necessary here is the Prime Minister to say we're not going to have this entire process. Keir Starmer has already said himself he will not have a resignation honours list if he gets to be Prime Minister. It is, first of all, we knew this happened. We already knew this happened. But to see that video, it is genuinely galling. I mean, it really is, even though it's not telling you anything you didn't know beforehand.
Exactly.
To see the complete, I mean, to film it, to break the rules and then to film it.
Yeah,
and
then
not
you say
you
we knew to some extent. We've seen this kind of thing before. But your honour can be withdrawn, as I've said. There is a forfeiture system, so you're saying they should be taken.
I think none of these should go ahead, and resignation honours should not happen anymore. I mean, I think the way that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss actually as well have abused this system. I know usually Prime Ministers serve for a period of time and not the short kind of terms we've seen as, you know, different Prime Ministers every few months we had for a year. But this is absolutely galling. And I tell you the worst bit of it as well. Well, there's lots of worst bits to it. You know, I nominate my constituents for honours, for community service. I mean, and it really means something to them. It really does. And so I know some people say, why have any of this? Well, actually, when you can reward and acknowledge community, you know, activism or contribution, that is actually a really nice thing, I think, to have. But it is devalued, as is, you know, as Noel was saying, many of the Lords' appointments by completely frivolous appointments.
Would you block it? I mean, you have the opportunity. I understand there is a process, and you, as an individual MP, could write and say, I think these should be blocked.
Look, I think there is an important process of people respecting the predecessors' honours list. I think what's much more important here is if you are the recipient of an honour, you have to be able to hold your head high and say that I fundamentally have earned this. And I think that's a question that everyone should ask themselves when they get that letter in the post. And I think it is a matter for them,
I mean, how do you think corrosive is this to the public, Alva?
Well, Labour's been having this big debate because Gordon Brown took on this commission for Keir Starmer looking into devolution and how they could restructure things in the country. And I suppose the counterpoint to all of this is that actually Labour's been having a big ding-dong privately over whether they can afford to spend all the time to actually make meaningful reforms. The second that you actually think, why don't we get rid of the House of Lords, or why don't we make it a completely elected chamber, actually all the stooges in the Labour Party even just think that's a bit too radical. We don't want to waste too much time when we first get in. And so I think we'll probably, if Labour does win the next election, we'll see a very sort of muted version of that, but not the full hog.
Luke, a final word from you before we let you go.
Yeah, well, at the best of times, the public are fairly sceptical about the honours system. But I think what we've seen in recent weeks when we've spoken to people about it in focus groups is that now they're kind of flabbergasted. They just don't understand how these people who, as far as they can say, either didn't do very much or actually did quite a bad job or broke the rules and now being rewarded for that. It really, again, sticks in the public's craw and is just damaging to people's perception of politics right across the piece.
Luke Trill from More in Common, thank you very much. And just to let you know, as we have said before, you can now listen to Politics Live as a podcast, so you can catch up when you're on the bus or out walking the dog or whatever you do in the afternoon. Search Politics Live on BBC Sounds. You can even subscribe so you never miss an episode. Watching, of course, live is best of all. Let's talk about Labour's green pledges and commitment to make Britain a clean energy superpower and to cut bills, create jobs and provide energy security security. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has been making a speech in Edinburgh. It follows a controversial announcement that Labour would not grant any oil and gas licences once they get to government. But it has caused something of a backlash with the unions. Earlier, in an interview today on the BBC, Keir Starmer said this.
Oil and gas, as you know, will be part of the energy mix for decades to come, probably into the 2050s. But it is dwindling, and we've got to have a plan for what comes next that comes up alongside that. I think that one of the big mistakes that was made decades ago was when we knew that coal mining was coming to an end, we didn't have a government with the courage to plan for what happened next.
Well, that was Keir Starmer. Which is it, Jonathan? Is it oil and gas companies, you drill all you like for the next 18 months and have all the licences granted to you? We will let that happen, and only when we're in government will we not grant any further. We're going to have oil and gas for decades.
There's no contradiction at all in what Keir Starmer has just said in that interview. So we do believe that we've got to go for this clean energy sprint, that is the long-term answer on jobs, prosperity
with oil and
security.
gas until the 2050s.
Oil and gas on the existing fields we have in the North Sea and as part of our energy mix will continue to play a role right up into 2050. There's no cliff edge, there's no taps being turned off. There are particular needs that go beyond the electricity system, for instance, in industry and in domestic heating for things like gas. So all we are saying is there's no long-term feature in adding more licences to that extraction. But that extraction isn't going to go away. And we accept companies will have to make decisions now. They'll need some investment certainty. So it couldn't be any clearer than saying we're not going to revoke or end any licences, but we're not going to grant new ones. We're going to basically go for hydrogen, for offshore wind, for more solar, for taking the ban off onshore wind, for carbon capture, all these exciting new technologies where the jobs are no consolation prize, they're far in excess.
Well, let's see what the co-leader of the Green Party, Adrian Ramsey, thinks. Welcome to you, Adrian. It sounds perfectly sensible. We don't want the lights to be switched off. We don't want lots of people to lose their jobs. So Labour is saying, let's continue with the transition from now until we win the election, and then we'll phase it out over time. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think there's a lack of clarity over Labour's position. If you look at the announcements they made 10 days ago, they backtracked on their previous £28 billion promise to invest in the green transition that we all want to see. So it's unclear what investment they're willing to put in. And in terms of new oil and gas licences, I'm not clear from what Keir Starmer said this morning whether Labour will come out and clearly oppose the Rosebank oil field, which, if it's given the go-ahead in the coming weeks, would emit the same amount of carbon emissions as 28 low-income countries. So we would, just from that one oil field, be emitting more carbon emissions than 700 million people in the world.
All right.
Labour needs to take a clear stance on this, and that's not just about a position for when there may be a change of government. It's about creating an environment where investors are given a strong message from all political parties that we want to see the investment going into renewable energy, not into major oil and gas exploration that will completely bust any sort of climate targets.
Jonathan?
There couldn't be any clearer, Adrian. We will not revoke any oil and gas extraction licences when and if we form a Labour government, but we are not for granting further ones. And there is still a clear set of dividing lines between ourselves and the Conservative Party on the need for an active industrial policy, investing money alongside planning reform, changes to national grid that will deliver a clean energy system by 2030, well ahead of the government targets. But I would also say, respectfully to anyone in the Green Party, it's only Labour that can do this transition, because obviously yourselves, you oppose things like nuclear power, which we think are an essential part of the mix. The Green Party around large parts of England is very much a NIMBY party, opposing everything from new housing to new infrastructure. So therefore, I would say the balance between yourselves and the Conservative Party with the Labour Party in the middle, exciting, big, bold plans to get not just net zero delivered, but the economic benefits of that. It's Labour that's the big story there.
You know that's an outdated trope. Green councillors around the country are promoting the right sorts of developments that we want to see, supporting the huge opportunities that we have in home insulation, in renewable energy, in public transport, in supporting local farmers with this transition to a fairer, greener country and economy. And Labour are holding us back in far too many ways, giving developers carte blanche to allow new developments to go ahead without requiring the renewable energy and the home insulation that's needed. And Labour's plans to insulate people's homes around the country are inadequate. You're looking at getting homes to EPC level C. We need to be insulating homes thoroughly to really keep people's bills down, make the most of renewable energy and tackle the cost of living crisis.
John,
and if we're going to
19 million homes into EPCC is a huge commitment, as is our commitment to the transition of the steel industry to green steel, to build gigafactories so we can have electric vehicles and maintain the automotive sector in the UK. But I'd say again, there are technologies that are essential to the transition and to the economic benefits and national security being accrued to the UK. I think the Green Party's opposition to those technologies, particularly nuclear and small modular reactors, means that you cannot deliver that, whereas we've got a plan which is not just about net zero, it's about the economic benefits and national security being here in the UK, that I think is a compelling economic offer, as well as the one on climate.
Well, I'm picking up on that, Adrian, because Keir Starmer said very clearly in his speech that he didn't want to see a cliff edge. He compared it to the 1980s, when under Margaret Thatcher's government, all the coal mines were closed, or pretty well all of them, and it led, arguably, to the decimation of those communities. Isn't that what you're advocating now? Shut it all off now, and that will lead to a cliff edge economically.
No, absolutely not. This transition needs to be planned, and we need to engage businesses, we need to engage trade unions in the huge opportunities we have in these skills in green industries. But the point about oil and gas licenses is that there's already enough committed that would breach safe levels of global warming, of greenhouse gas emissions. So to be backing new oil and gas licenses or failing to clearly oppose Rosebank, as Labour seems to be at the moment, is deeply irresponsible. And when we need to look at the numbers here, yes, they need to add up financially, absolutely. And the investment that we put in will more than repay itself in terms of the benefits to society. But the numbers have got to add up in terms of climate as well.
Well, let me put that. Is this a climate emergency or isn't it, Jonathan?
It is a climate emergency.
Right. Well, then shouldn't you be making and taking that strong stance? And the same with the Conservatives. I mean,
I think we have. Last time, a week ago, I was on these programmes. It was the other case being put to us that we were being too radical, too ambitious. So I'll take the position in the middle.
Last week,
no, we did. We had exactly the same policy. We have never said we will revoke oil and gas licences in the North Sea. We've said we will not grant new ones. It has always been that position, actually since January of this year when that was in the public domain. So I reject that entirely. And on the 28 billion, it is, I think, far better to judge any policy by what you get out of it rather than what you spend. You can't just come in on day one and hit that level of expenditure. We've laid out these plans, whether it is home insulation, green steel, gigafactories, the need to increase onshore wind, offshore wind, hydrogen. The details are all there and through it in the speech.
Well, you back them. You back them. If you call it a change or rowing back or watering, but these are policies that you back. Obviously, phasing in a £28 billion investment and continuing with oil and gas licences that your government will grant.
Absolutely.
And then they'll change it.
Well, no, I think that this is a perfectly sensible, middle-of-the-road approach that the government is taking and which shares some of the approach that Labour is taking. My problem is that Labour has got this £28 billion commitment that they've then rowed back from. They want more onshore wind, but they also want...
They're just not going to do it necessarily the first few years.
They consistently change the policy in pursuit of whatever is politically expedient this week.
Right.
That is going to be a huge problem for Labour come the next election, because what is the Labour Party you want? Is it the Labour Party that says we want more onshore wind and we want to empower communities, or the Labour Party that says we want more onshore wind and we're not going to...
Well, I'm going to come back to you on the issue of onshore wind and planning more generally. Middle of the road, a sort of solution or whatever, the phrase that Matt used, is middle of the road going to wash in terms of the climate?
In terms of the actual policy, probably not. I mean, we are so far behind that these sorts of conversations and plans should have been, taking place for the 2019 general election. That wasn't a green election. We're already kind of miles off hitting 2030 as a net zero target. Even 2050 is actually really ambitious, because to actually realistically hit that, you need to have the bulk of things done by 2030, and then that's just the long tail finishing things. So we're miles off. But the problem is the politics of it. Rishi Sunak is not very green compared with Boris Johnson. He's just not personally very interested in that. Labour are the only real opposition on that, and they're much more concerned with appearing economically credible than they are seeming radical and green. They've made this speech today, but that's you're more comfortable, actually quite happy to have a big sort of awkward U-turn. We're just being too economically credible. We can't spend that much.
I think it's a real mistake, and you see this in a lot of the coverage of that decision, to posit economic responsibility as being opposed to ambition on climate or some kind of economic transformation. You only get one with the other, and the cost of government borrowing has gone up, certainly has been going up since particularly the Liz Truss brief government. So you've got to acknowledge that. But also, it's not just about, you can't just turn a tap on and hit that level of investment. That will build up over time, and clarifying that position. And of course, if the government did some of the things we want to do, we'd count that towards the expenditure as well. So just clarifying that position is not a U-turn away from the ambition on the policy. It's how you actually deliver it.
Your readers behind green initiatives, the sorts of things that we're discussing here?
So the goal of net zero is a good goal. And it's, we are all very much aware of the fact that climate change is a real dangerous thing. We want a lovely, healthy, luscious green planet for our grandchildren.
But we're not prepared to make the sacrifices.
No, it cannot come at the cost of hard-up households who, at the moment's number one priority is the cost of living crisis and issues like the mortgage rises. That is the main concern with Labour's policy.
Well, Adrian, I'll come back to you in a minute. Adrian, would you respond there broadly to what Noah has just said, that it can't come at a cost for hard-pressed families and households?
We absolutely need to have a complete focus on the cost of living crisis, and the huge rise in energy bills is one of the reasons for that, which is why we've been arguing for a nationwide programme to insulate people's homes, to keep bills down and create jobs, as well as tackling carbon emissions. And in terms of the wider economy, we need to create a fairer economy as well. One of the ways in which we need to pay for this transition to a fairer, greener economy is if we could increase taxes on the very wealthiest 1%, even just a 1% wealth tax on the richest 1%, could create tens of billions a year that we could invest in these changes. And it's also an anti-inflationary measure as well to bring about a fairer society.
What does everyone think of a wealth tax then?
I'm going to say, first of all, the cost of living crisis has been predominantly caused by energy costs, particularly not just to heat your home, but also for food costs and what that has meant. That is because of our exposure to fossil fuels, and we will never get past the risk of these crises till we reduce that exposure. And our plan today is fundamentally about never being in this position again, where we're not in a position where some event happens, in this case the horrible events that led to Russia's invasion, the illegal invasion of Ukraine.
Yes.
We never want to be in that position again, but we will always be at risk unless we fundamentally reduce that exposure. And just on the Clean Power Plan, our target for 2030, that honestly, in terms of ambition, is at the outer edge of what is possible, but that's why it's a stretching target. The government's is 5 years after ours, but doesn't really matter what their target is because they're nowhere near to hitting it. They've got none of the tools in place to do it.
What the government has actually delivered, we've delivered a faster decarbonisation programme than almost any other country in the world, and we've coupled it
until this point, or recently, relatively speaking.
And we've coupled it with huge economic growth around the jobs that go into that greener economy, whether it's on the banks of the Humber, building some of the wind turbines that are now off the east coast and elsewhere. So there's a lot of work that has gone on.
Yes, but there's been mixed messaging. I mean, there have been a lot of conservative. There've been a lot of Conservative Prime Ministers, of course, so it's quite hard to keep up. But, Boris Johnson, I think, promised to drop the ban on onshore wind development. Rishi Sunak, well, it's still in place, isn't it? So that's not being developed because, as I think it was Alva said, Rishi Sunak's not as green, is he, as Boris Johnson. And on planning, Boris Johnson had to drop the planning bill and legislation because of opposition from MPs like you.
Well, not MPs like me, but MPs of my party, that is true. Yes. I mean, I do, to some extent, take issue with Alpha's point. I think the Prime Minister sees both the necessity of that transition and also the huge economic opportunity that it provides for the UK. So I think it's important to restate the Prime Minister's green credentials, but it is also right to say that we have to have a housing policy that builds the right number of houses in the right places.
Or just not enough of them.
Well, exactly. We do need to build more. No one disputes that.
Adrian Ramsey from the Green Party, thank you very much for joining us. Let's just have a listen to this. Former Prime Minister David Cameron giving evidence at the COVID inquiry.
The inquiry has received witness statements from Jeremy Hunt, who was the Secretary of State for Health and then Health and Social Care from 2012 to 2018. Were you aware that during the time that you were in power, Mr Hunt laboured considerable concerns about the structural problems within NHS capacity and the workforce and funding, as he has set out in his witness statement?
I've read his witness statement. He was a very capable health secretary. I worked with him extremely closely. Of course, he was always batting for the NHS and for all the extra resources he could get. These decisions were arrived at collectively. I agree with a lot of what's in his witness statement, where he says there's more that could be done, for instance, for future workforce planning. but I will absolutely defend the record of the government in both getting control of the finances and increasing funding for the health service at the same time.
Well, let's get reaction from the panel to that. I mean, the accusation is that austerity, the period of austerity from 2010 to 2015, left this country exposed, more exposed than it should have been. One of the examples was running the National Health Service at such a high capacity that it couldn't cope in the event of a pandemic like the one we've had.
Well, I think the premise of the 2010 and indeed the 2015 election campaign was that the public finances were in such a parlous state. We needed to make some very tough choices.
So
Nonetheless,
you admit they were affected public services?
Well, of course they affected public services. That was completely open in the election campaign and throughout the Parliament. What is important to say, though, is the thing that was protected absolutely throughout that process was the health service. And so I think we have to say that the austerity necessitated some immensely difficult choices. It's easy to look back with hindsight and say, well, maybe I would have done that rather than the other. I think the key point, though, is to say that they were difficult choices made knowingly and that they were protecting the health service above all other public services.
I mean, hindsight is a wonderful thing in this case.
Well, you don't expect me to say nice things about David Cameron or austerity. I mean, I would say objectively, you have to point out, first of all, Matt, that the spending settlements for the NHS under David Cameron's governments were very, weak, even compared to previous Conservative governments. I mean, this was a very difficult period.
But better than huge numbers of other public services.
I would like, well, yeah, that's relative. I would like this inquiry genuinely to give us something that we feel we will be better prepared for future pandemics, future events. And I think you do have to look particularly at the drastic cuts to local government and how that pushed more need into the health service, what that meant in terms of the capacity to absorb crisis when the workforce and the beds issue was so strained at the time. That would be genuinely useful. David Cameron's reputation is what it is and it's not very good, so that's not going to affect it. But let's try and learn some real lessons. And this was a period. There were political choices here. Corporation tax was reduced very significantly during that period alongside these very limited spending cuts. Right. You reversed that as a Conservative Party, well, I know. But these were choices. Let's look at them objectively and try and learn something from this.
Are your readers interested in seeing a former Prime Minister like David Cameron answer questions about policies that they undertook during that period of 2010 to 2015 to see if we were prepared enough for COVID pandemic?
I think above all, our readers are focusing on their grocery shops, which are becoming unaffordable, things like energy costs. But I think everyone appreciates that we need to learn the lessons. We need to know where government went wrong and right in terms of preparedness. Now, clearly, Labour did leave the country with a lot of debt that needed tackling. But then there's also this issue of priorities and were cuts made in the right places. And it is, I think, a bit of a scandal that the country wasn't as prepared as it could have been for a catastrophe like this. It was very unprecedented, but an issue, pandemic's not an unheard of event altogether, and there should have been more preparations in place.
Will we be better prepared next time?
For the pandemic, well, I think the problem is that the next challenge is not the one that we're familiar with. We're not going to have another coronavirus. Is it going to be a flu pandemic the way people were expecting? Is it going to be something completely different? It's preparing for the next thing. Is the challenge AI? It's these things that are on the periphery of government consciousness that actually prime ministers need to keep an eye on, even though it doesn't really affect their electoral prospect. It's such long-term planning, which we know government is quite bad at. That's the real challenge.
Right, and I mean, that is something that you may have to deal with if you win the next election. Will you make those decisions ahead of time?
Well, I think, first of all, you learn from things in British history, and this is what this process should do. I mean, all parliamentarians should seek to do so. I think if you compare, for instance, the resilience of the country when the global financial crisis hit compared to the energy crisis that we have had and the pandemic, I do think Labour's record is much more robust in terms of the health of the public realm, the health of public services, than the Conservative parties. But it's, this is all with retrospect and hindsight. What matters is the future and taking that seriously. The storage of PPE, all of this needs to be done better.
We're out. I have to say goodbye from all of us here. Thank you.